it's not just corporate services, it's across all functions, and I'll talk about that in a bit. And then it applies to staff and service users. And again, this is another, public bodies sometimes think it's just about service users, but it's about public sector staff and their equality and human rights as well. And it's an ongoing obligation until this Act of 2014 is repealed, but until then it is an ongoing obligation on public bodies. And you often hear people saying it's a proactive and positive obligation, and this is so it's about public bodies not waiting around to get sued or a problem to occur, but it's really about looking and getting your house in order with regards to human rights and equality, and that's the whole purpose and idea and the spirit behind this particular section. What do public bodies have to do? And this is also contained in section 42, section 42.2. And this is about to assess and address and report, to set out in its strategic plan an assessment of the human rights and equality issues it believes to be relevant to its functions and purpose in a manner accessible to the public. So again, like, everybody should be able to know that a public body has done this assessment, because it has to be like on their website or made accessible to the public. And the other part of this is to set it out in their strategic plan. And just to point out, that's an organizational assessment. Again, going back to across the functions, it's not that you assess every single, although you could, but it's not to assess every single document in an organization. But what the duty requires is that cross-organizational assessment. And then secondly, to set out in its strategic plan the policies, plans and actions in place or proposed to be in place to address those issues, also accessible to the public, again, on a website, or in this case, the strategic plan. So it's the actions to address the issues raised. So you can see already the assessment is a foundational piece of work, so you have to get the assessment right in order to get the actions right, because the third bit is reporting. You have to report on the developments and achievements in relation to 1 and 2. So you're not reporting on anything you've done in equality and human rights in the last year. You're reporting on what you have said in your address, in that policies, plans, that action plan. So the assessment, the action plan, and then you're reporting on those every year. So that's, and then again, that's like in an annual report and so forth. So that's what a public body is required to do. And I'm just going to go into talk about I suppose maybe the first 2 bits, assess and address in more detail. But before I go into that, I just wanted to talk about the strategic planning bit, because this is actually like our big focus of our work in IREC, is around the strategic plan. Because if you have an assessment in a strategic plan, it's more likely to fall down into your annual work plans. You're also guaranteeing that there's senior level commitment to the duty, to the statutory obligation. And it helps that systematic and proactive approach to identifying and addressing issues. So like, we come across a lot of public bodies who do great human rights and equality work, but it tends to like be a bit siloed. It tends to finish after a year or 2, and then it doesn't the learning isn't necessarily brought into the organization. So really what the duty is trying to do with that set out in your strategic plan is to try to make it part and parcel of what a public body does, trying to speak to that transformative kind of impact of the public sector duty, looking at how you do your business really is what insane. And then also it's an ongoing process, as I said before. So every strategic plan, you should be doing this work again. So you're continually assessing, addressing and reporting in each strategic cycle. Now, just on the strategic plan, you probably are aware that there's local authorities who have published their corporate plans over the last couple of years after the local elections. So actually, I think it was like over 90% of the plans referenced the duty. Some referenced it, some making a commitment to do the public sector duty assessment over the next year. Others laying out their assessment as such. Now, to my knowledge, it was mostly the first and second categories. So say, for example, Meath County Council, who we were doing a bit of work with, they laid out that how they're going to do the assessment, and they started that process last year. The second thing is government departments have started to come out with their statements of strategy in the last couple of weeks. So far, the Department of Justice, the Department of Rural and Community Development, the Department of Transport, and the new Department of Equality, of the very long name, which I'm not going to say because I'm definitely going to get it wrong. There's 4, to my knowledge, that have come out so far. Again, 2 of them have said that they will commit to undertaking the assessment. That's the Department of Justice and the Department of Rural and Community Development. But the Department of Transport have published their assessment, and so has the new Equality Department has published quite a detailed assessment. Now, I haven't had a chance to have a proper look at it, but it's just to be aware of that yourselves, that we did quite a lot of work with government departments last year. So expecting to see, good results from that engagement in the next couple of weeks. Just as I mentioned before, across the functions of an organisation is a very important message from ourselves who give support and guidance to public bodies. So again, that's organisational planning, corporate services. So the duty applying to strategic planning, budget allocation, procurement and grant funding. And as some of you may know, we've been doing a bit of work around the procurement space, and the Office of Government Procurement are coming out with updated guidelines where they're going to include the public sector duty in. And obviously there's loads more work to be done in that space, but it was good that the OGP were willing to take that on and make it clear to public bodies. Also, in terms of human resources, there's recruitment, HR policies and practices, and staff capacity building. Service provision is another functional area that's very important. Research and policy development or review of policy. And then regulatory and oversight functions that a public body may have. So, for example, HICWA. There's a very more obvious example that we would encourage bodies like HICWA or the Inspector of Prisons, for example, to integrate the duty into their regulatory processes, because for us that would be a very important multiplier effect of the duty to other public bodies as well. So just in terms of our role, you probably know our role in relation to the duty is guidance, support, monitoring and enforcement. But this is like the guidance that we've produced so far, and some of you might be aware of it. But I'm probably going to speak, we have the core guidance that came out in 2019, but last year we had 2 more pieces, which was a tool for consultation and also a tool for an evidence-based assessment. So I'm just going to talk about the assessment tool now, and I'm also going to touch on the consultation tool as well when I'm talking about civil society. But all of these are available on our website, and feel free to use them or use the animation that we did as well. It's all there for use. So in terms of like an evidence-based assessment, again, as I was saying to you before, the assessment is a really important part. The foundational piece is a critical step. And the learning from our pilots, we did actually 5 pilot projects, 2 in local authorities in a university setting, and also in the probation service and the Irish prison service. And one of the key parts that we're learning from it was that if you get the assessment right, if you really identify what the issue is, what is the equality and human rights issue, it makes it much easier to come up with an action and then to report on it as well. So that's why the assessment is very important. And also, as I said to you before, in terms of the assessment, it's across the organisation as well. So it's looking at all the different functional areas. And again, like what we're in our assessment tool, we're messaging out to public bodies that the identified groups are the people that need to be consulted and looked at when you're doing an assessment. So obviously you're probably fairly familiar with the equality grounds, but then also people at risk of poverty and social exclusion as well. Because I mean, it is likely that there will be a ground added to the equality legislation in the future. But also, if you look at, we have a composite duty, which is equality and human rights. So you can always look at people at risk of poverty and social exclusion under the human rights element of the public sector duty as well. And we also are keen to emphasize to public body the whole concept of intersectionality, that people may experience more than one form of discrimination as well. So in terms of the assessment process, what we say to public bodies is there needs to be commitment by the senior management team at the beginning of the process and throughout the process and after the process, just all the time, basically. So that's a key point, because sometimes people say, oh, listen, you go, off you go, you do the assessment and come back to us. But it's very important that there is that continued engagement by the senior management team. And then also the establishment of a cross-function working group in order to do the assessment, and to have a working group that's cross-function and cross-grade, if possible, especially cross-function. So you're bringing in people from across the organisation to do this assessment. So it's not just corporate services doing the assessment or the social inclusion unit doing the assessment. It has to be across the organisation, and then creating a shared understanding of equality and human rights before you go into the assessment, maybe by doing some capacity building around equality and human rights. So that's before the you kind of get stuck into the assessment. And then in terms of the assessment process, there's just a number of different parts. As I mentioned there already, there's leadership and responsibility. So the senior level commitment and the setting up of the group. But then there's also gathering evidence for the assessment. So our guidance highlights the importance of taking an evidence-based approach to undertaking an assessment. And I think this is a part where civil society can be very important. And obviously we message out that if you're gathering information, civil society submissions, reports and so forth are very important to gathering this information, and we have that in our assessment tool and examples of it as well. And then the next part is to assess and prioritise the relevant equality and human rights issues. So once the data and information has been gathered across different functional areas, then you start to prioritise what are the key points. And actually, when we did the pilot projects, loads of issues came up, especially under human resources and service provision. And then you have to try to figure out like what are the critical ones for a public body. And then the fourth step here is to validate and approve a final draft of the assessment. So the final, our message to public bodies is the final draft assessment and action plan should be checked and modified and validated through a participative exercise involving civil society organisations and staff that are representative of the identified groups. So we actually have a whole tool on this called a consultation tool, where it goes into how you do that in a really meaningful way, and that the organizations are involved, that they look at the assessment, they identify the gaps, they give back information, then the public body goes away, makes adjustments based on that, comes back, checks in with the focus group to make sure that the changes have been made. I mean, so that's all in the consultation tool. So that's a very important part as well for civil society organisations, and also staff, public sector staff as well, and trade unions who would represent a lot of staff in the public sector. And then the last one is to publish and communicate the assessment, which once has been approved at senior management level. So there's the functional area. So that's kind of the assessment process. I mean, that is what we recommend in IREC to public bodies as a meaningful and evidence-based assessment. So in terms of an evidence base, I'm not going to go through these slides, but there are just a couple of slides here on examples of sources of information that a public body can delve into: the consultation with staff and service users, data, and different reports from civil society organisations. Public bodies could also look at cases from the Workplace Relations Commission as well. It could be a key source of information. And then there's also internal sources of information as well, which is organisation evaluations, staff and customer surveys, complaints received, for example. So I just thought what I would do is just give you an example in terms of service provision, just some of the examples that came up from on the pilots that we did, of some of the issues that came up. Now, this isn't a particular public body, I just took some examples, but so it was just to give you a sense of what was involved. Sorry, I just wanted to get my notes here so don't forget to see. So just on the left-hand side, sorry, you can see like the issues that came up for some public bodies. And I have to say the main point was that there was a knowledge gap, that public bodies didn't know who was or who wasn't using their services when you looked at it from an equality and human rights perspective. So their services were not adapted to meet the needs as a result. And the second big issue was that they didn't consider equality and human rights when developing or reviewing policies or protocols, plans, or services. So for example, like when we develop service level policies and protocols, we do not currently consider equality and human rights issues. And that theme was quite strong across the pilots. And then in terms of the actions, you can see on the right-hand side a flavour of some of the actions that came up. So undertaking an audit of current service provision, communication tools, and an accessibility audit to more fully understand user experiences, expectations, and requirements from an equality and human rights perspective. The collection and use of equality data to inform policy practices and services. Develop a mechanism for listening to and understanding diverse communities and groups, underline the importance of ongoing consultation with a diversity of stakeholders. So again, it was that point of not just having this once-off consultation with 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 you know, a few groups, you know, but how do you have this mechanism for this, an ongoing dialogue, really? And then providing relevant training for management and staff on issues related to equality and human rights. Developing internal processes so that equality and human rights issues inform policy development in a systematic way. And then last but not least, identifying positive action measures to engage minority groups or reasonable accommodation measures as well. So, so there were just some of the actions that came up. Sorry, I'm just going back to my notes here. There was an important part I wanted to say on this, which I think is important for yourselves. The experience in the UK over the last 10 years around the public sector equality duty is public bodies are doing a mix of actions. So some are what they call foundational actions, and some are specific actions, particular ones on areas. So for example, like some organizations look to, okay, how can we look at our policy, how we develop policy, or how we review policy, and is there a way we can come up with a mechanism for doing that? So that's like a foundational action. So you're going to the core of how you do things, how you develop policy, or they looked at capacity building for staff, you know, like, so that's a big thing in the public sector. There's a real need for capacity building around equality and human rights. So maybe that's another foundational action that you can look at from an organizational perspective. But then in the UK, other public bodies looks to, okay, we have a big issue around disability, or we have a big issue around gender, or for minority ethnic groups, or just picking out some big ones. And then they might have a targeted initiative around a few actions around that. So what happened was, it seems to be a mix of actions, which I think is actually very, very useful for public bodies to look at in Ireland as well, because if you just look at just doing like projects and looking at different areas, you're not always getting to look at, well, what can we do to start changing the way we do things in our organization from an equality and human rights perspective. So that's so, like, for example, in that one, the actions, the second last one there, develop internal processes. It's looking at that more, and then also looking at positive action measures as well, which are not very common in public bodies. It has started to become a bit more, but still reasonable accommodation and positive action are still an underdeveloped area, I would say, and the public sector duty could assist in promoting that more. So, sorry. I'm just going to get a bit of water. So just on the last bit, which is around consultation and the role of civil society organisations, just in terms of civil society, like IREC would see civil society as a very important partner in monitoring the implementation of the duty, but also making sure that the duty is meaningful and it's evidence-based as well. So we would strongly encourage civil society to use the duty to highlight equality and human rights issues in their engagement with public bodies. So, for example, even apart from assess, address, report, remember I was saying earlier on about the overarching obligation, like that's there all the time. To have regard to the need to eliminate discrimination, promote equality, protect human rights in what you do every day. And in the UK, there has been a lot of judicial reviews on this issue, where a decision has been made by a public body where, you know, there wasn't regard to the need to eliminate discrimination, promote equality and protect human rights. And because of that, then a public body was required to go back and revisit the whole decision. So it has had quite an impact in the UK. It hasn't been used as yet in the Irish context, but there is the potential for judicial review to be used in the Irish context in the future. The second thing is the communicate rights holder expertise in the assess, address and report. And we have obviously in our consultation tool and assessment tool messaged that out to public bodies that you need to, in that process, at each stage of that process, you need to engage with civil society. Obviously encouraging civil society to reference the duty in policy, advocacy and campaign work wherever possible. I guess I know that there is PQs that have been asked in relation to the duty from different civil society organisations, so that's a common tool that's used. And then I just have here partners in monitoring compliance with the duty. So, you know, that's, I mean, the monitoring and enforcement of the duty is still an area that's under development with ourselves at IREC, but we do see civil society as a very important partner in that going forward. Just the last slide that I was going to show you today was just in terms of our tool for a consultative approach. And I probably encourage you to read this tool, because really if your project is about engaging with an assessment, that maybe this guidance might be helpful to you in messaging out to public bodies that, well, this is the guidance from IREC on what needs to happen. But what we have said is that consult with service users and staff at each of the 3 stages of assess, address and report in a timely way, so that, you know, a public body would draft an assessment after going through their own process and have and send that draft assessment to a focus group made up of, you know, the identified groups, and seek feedback on the gaps in that, or any feedback, and then that they would take that on board. But so we've done it in a way where, you know, there's time given for civil society. I think sometimes with consultations, you hear about a consultation when it's happening in about 2 days' time, and you don't have time to prepare yourself properly. But I think that was one of the messages we wanted to get across in the tool. But also that it's a part of a strategic planning cycle. So if you know that a public body has a strategic plan coming up, or they've referenced it in strategic plan that they plan to do this work, we would encourage civil society organisations to approach the public body and ask are they going to consult in line with IREC's guidance on the issue. So that's something to bear in mind. We also, as I said before, it's an inclusive consultation with all the identified groups, and then inviting groups to give feedback on a draft assessment. And just about the reporting, like, I know public bodies could report, oh, listen, on progress and achievements, we did this, we did that, we did the other, and everything went really well. So, I mean, obviously we would encourage public bodies to reach out to groups and say, look, how do we do? Was there any progress made on that particular issue, and to have that openness and transparency around the process. And also it gives that evidence-based approach again to assess, address and report. I think they're all the part, like, sorry, I was going into such detail there, but sometimes it's good to go into detail, just maybe to be clear about what we kind of message out to public bodies on the public sector duty. So I'm happy to answer. Just to say on the last one, I just have a slide on key messages. I can send this to you afterwards, Rachel, if you want to circulate it to the group. And then the last one is I just have a list of all the resources on our website. So if people want to go in and look at videos or the animation or the tools, it's all listed in that slide. So I'll just stop sharing now. I'll try to stop sharing.